How are you guys doing today? Good. Good. Well, I appreciate that there's even one person here on a Sunday afternoon, let alone more than one. So thank you for coming to hear me speak today. So I'm going to be talking about teaching and reading Ovidian sexual violence in early modern literature in the undergraduate classroom. I've prepared a very formal talk because I have a lot to say. But if you have any questions, please just raise your hand, or if I can clarify anything. So much of the early modern stuff, as I'm sure you know in your own respective fields, is rote. So I just assume everybody knows what I'm talking about without remembering that not everybody spends 15 years of their lives reading Shakespeare. Okay, so just some first comments to get out of the way. I just want to thank the organizers and congratulate them for putting on this counter conference. It's been a really great experience to be here among people who care about inclusive pedagogy and lifting up students instead of doing the top-down hierarchy, which I'll talk about in a bit. So to start, my name is Alexander Lowe McAdams. That is not a typo. It's Alexander because my mother, when she found out she was pregnant with a girl, wanted to play pranks on men for the entirety of my existence. Number one, because she wanted her daughter to be a warrior. She named me after Alexander the Great. And two, we discovered that Alexander means leader of men. So there you go, which will be really interesting getting into the nuance of this talk today, as you'll see in a moment. So I study early modern literature at Rice. I'm in the English department, but I study English literature, but I also study classical Latin literature and the nuances that English authors are using that get lost in the translations. So if you don't read the original Latin and do that comparative reading, you miss a whole lot of stuff. And the subfields that I also study are early modern science and natural philosophy. And of course, all of those works were written in Latin. So that's why I study the classics. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. This talk is Enraptured, why we read about sexual violence in early modern literature and why early modern writers were so captivated, enraptured, right? Rapire by these narratives. So we're going to start here with the art of remembering. I'll be talking quite a bit about remembering today. So remembering, the state of having or bringing to mind an awareness of someone or something that one has seen, known, or experienced in the past. So before we begin, I want to be completely transparent and add some context to my professional background, which I talked a little bit about to begin with. In a lot of ways, this talk would be about my status as an informed outsider to the classics. To start, as I'm sure you have already gathered, I am not a classic scholar and don't claim to be. I study early modern English literature and New Latin through the context of 17th century astronomy. As an early modernist, I have a special relationship to the concept of remembering, a concept that I bring to the fore today. Most of the tropes and supposed inventions that are markers of the early modern world, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, are in fact reconfigurations of classical antiquity and conventions that they proffered and proliferated in the ancient world. Indeed, when Renaissance humanists first began their manuscript hunting, they sought to recapture the ancient Rome in which Cicero, Quintilian, Virgil, and Ovid lived, walked, and wrote. In their pursuit of La Rinascita, the rebirth of classical culture, they engaged in a very specific task, the project of remembering, of recapitulating the past through careful exegesis and textual analysis. Second, I am not a master Latinist. In fact, I'm kind of bad at it. My vocabulary is not great. I have to look up every other word because I just don't read it enough. But that's okay. In the real world, there are dictionaries, right? Most of my Latin vocabulary is steeped in the realm of early modern history of science. So in other words, very technical, more than a little crazy philosophical texts. The wild west of speculative philosophy, so to speak. And by and large, these works delve into early modern transmission and adaptations of both classical authors like Ovid and Virgil, and something called the Prisca Theologia, or ancient theology. And this is the view that there's one single religion in the world, and each subsequent religious movement that comes up is getting at the same truth. So you see this quite a bit in early modern natural philosophy, which then becomes what we now consider experimental science, where the wisdom of the ancients isn't a threatening heresy, right? It's not heathenism. Of course, the Catholic Church had some opinions about that, but for by and large, this idea of Prisca Theologia, that the wisdom of the ancients, that the customs of the ancients were something to not be afraid of, and instead to value. So yes, what this research focuses, or what this research focus really requires on the one hand, is a very basic familiarity with classical texts. Classical texts as works of literature, not syntactical puzzles, which I was speaking with Gregory before the panel or this talk started, that it's amazing how radical that is in some classrooms. In other words, I think through how early modern authors co-opt, adapt, and in a lot of ways rewrite these classical stories. Much of that research relies on etymological study, digging into the bowels of not only the Oxford English Dictionary, but also the Oxford Latin Dictionary, Lewis and Short, and on a few very mind-numbing occasions, the TLL, the Thesaurus Linguae Latinae. On the other hand, since I am a literary scholar, my primary pedagogical and research methods are always in service of answering bigger, more speculative questions. Why do certain literary tropes persist? What about them is valuable for our understanding of our cultural history? And why are they such powerful symbols for early modern authors to mimic, imitate, and adapt? In the fall 2018 semester, I found a rare opportunity. For one, I had the unwavering support of a faculty member who was excited to co-teach with a graduate student, and all the people who have been in graduate school or are in graduate school now know that that is rarely the case at an R1 institution. A precious resource, classics professor Scott McGill expressed an interest in developing and teaching a Renaissance Latin course with me. There was no other course like it on the books in the Department of Classics and European Studies, and I was determined to teach another class at Rice, an institution with a very small student to faculty ratio, so it is exceptionally hard to get teaching experience there. So I took the lead on course development, another rare opportunity, and drafted the syllabus with reading assignments, potential other assignments like short essays, a couple of reading quizzes. And we met several times across the spring semester or the fall semester to revise, redevelop, reconfigure, all of that sort of stuff. So by January 2019, this was a year ago, we were off to the races, ready to embark on a brand new course, new Latin, Renaissance Latin, new Latin, and above all else, new knowledge. So this is the second half of the other image of the Rape of Lucrece by Titian. Remembering hierarchies. Hierarchy is a system or organization in which groups or people are ranked one above the other according to status or authority. As an early career female researcher, I am acutely aware of my position in the classroom. Even though I have been teaching as instructor of record in the undergraduate classroom since 2011, the fact remains that I am closer in age to my undergraduate students than they are to their tenured professors for other classes. On day one of the spring semester, however, I was even more aware of my subject position than usual. For this time, I was reminded, perhaps for the first time since I began teaching in higher education, that my subject position as teacher, subject matter expert, and authority figure felt more tenuous than it had for quite some time. Rice being the small institution that it is, all of my students had taken class from Professor McGill many times over. When he walked into the room, he already knew the contours of their personal, academic, and extracurricular lives. And we were about to dive into the syllabus before I had to remind them that one of their professors who'd be marking half of their assignments didn't know who they were. So that was the first moment that I really realized that, that something different was going on in this room. And for the first time since I began teaching, I felt like I was the one who had to explain what I was doing there. Very different from how I teach class on my own. There were also other adjustments. Brace yourselves. The demographics of my students was unusual. First, the class was small. There were 5 students and 1 was auditing, so it was very intimate. And second, they were all males, only one of whom was a person of color. I was literally the token female in the room. So when we got to this unit on rape and sexual violence, it was buckle up, okay. Even as an instructor of the English Renaissance, the demographic divide among my students is pretty even, if not along minority and race identities that have been at the very least split evenly among genders. It was strange to walk into a room and see only males in there, and the fact that it was normal to them was really interesting, an interesting phenomenon. There was also the fact that my teaching philosophy was completely different than the department upon which I was interloping. Furthermore, my own teaching philosophy is decidedly non-hierarchical. When I walk into the classroom, I am more invested in the students' readings of the text than what I have to say. This pedagogical method is fairly standard in modern language literary studies because, after all, the author is dead. We don't have a Ouija board. The text says what it says, so we're going to discuss it, right? In other words, I emphasize that textual authority is dependent on the readers themselves. Everyone in the classroom has the same access to the text. Really, the text says what it says. Of course, critical historical milieu is exceptionally important in something as grounded in a different cultural context as early modern literature, but again, it says what it says. The differences arise in our subject positions. So this is where the part where things get interesting in a discussion-based classroom that I like to read how student A from an affluent family in the Northeast and how student B from a first-generation student from rural Texas read the same sonnet, for example, is exceptionally eye-opening, not only for me as a teacher to remember that that there are different points of view, but also for them, right? That one's approach to language is exceptionally subjective, and language isn't capital T truth. That's one of the big things that I like to emphasize. And these are also moments that I live for in the classroom, not only because they reveal the important differences in our everyday lived experiences, but also because they displace my hierarchical role of authority in the room. As such, my classroom is not a top-down pecking order or a hierarchy. And while I technically know more, or I am technically more informed than my students, after all, I've spent way too much time studying the stuff I've studied. I will one day defend my dissertation. Our time in the classroom is not about me. If they want my reading of the text, they will ask for it, and they often do not. I take that as a sign, right? And I fundamentally believe that my job as the instructor is to ask the probing questions and to teach students how to answer questions critically, mindfully, and creatively. I emphasize that I'm here as the resource. I can help you get better at writing. I can help you develop a research project. I can help you acquire research skills, but I am not the textual authority, right? I mean, obviously they have to base their analyses and like fact, right? They need evidence. They can't say 1984 is about alien invasion unless they have some great textual evidence for that. In my fervor to teach the literary aspects of these classical texts, however, I forgot that this class, Latin 309, was first and foremost a language class. Not every session can be modeled after the de-hierarchical model, and in some ways, this de-hierarchy was a direct hindrance to the course outcomes, i.e. a cohesive bird's eye view of like 400 years that we now consider the Renaissance or early modern studies. Professor McGill was instrumental in this regard because there are instances where a right answer is necessary. I want to emphasize how phenomenal and supportive he was to work with and how grateful I am to have him on my team and behind me. And he showed by example the importance of asking students to name the principal parts of a verb, the purpose of a subjunctive, and wait a second, is that a passive periphrastic, a gerundive, or something else? I still don't know. I know what it says, couldn't tell you the principal parts. There were other times when our students wanted one particular answer to translations. And as everybody in this room knows, while some translations are easy, others are more difficult to parse and come by. And no small wonder either. A major component of my Latin language education has emphasized authoritative translation. Marked deliberation that shows a duty to the text, its central meaning, and its interpretive force in a modern language. These are all valuable outcomes, one that I do not disparage or discount. However, my being a literary scholar who is interested in the gray areas of language, I knew that these moments were teachable, moments that are sometimes taken for granted when syntactical precision becomes the sole purpose of the undergraduate classroom. Case in point, our very first reading of the semester, Flavio Biondo's Poemium to Roma Triumphans, Rome in Triumph. Again, get ready. In it, Flavio wistfully longs for the days of ancient Rome. Quod imperii majestate orbi terrarum communicata societas festae pacis omnium. Romani enim maximum orbis partem suae subactum dictioni ita pacaverunt cultamque bonus moribus et artibus rediderunt, ut disjunctae mari montibusque et fluminus separatae gentes ac linguis literaturaque differentes populi per linguae Latinae linguae communionem perque communes omnibus Romanos magistratus una eademque civitas sint effecti. This is the translation that we read parts of. By the greatness of its empire, the world has come to share in joyful peace. After the Romans had brought the largest part of the world under their sway, they had it so peaceful and so civilized, with good customs and conduct that races divided by sea and mountain and kept apart by rivers and peoples who had different languages and ways of writing were made one in the same state through sharing the Latin language. Given the fact that this conference is called Our Voices for Inclusive Classics, I doubt I am the only one here whose first inclination is to play the game Spot the Apologist for Imperialism. After we got through the grammar and syntax, gratias tibi ago magister scote, I asked my students their first impressions of reading as we began to dive into the cultural context of Flavio's 1459 treatise. By and large, their reactions were innocuous and a little precious. He loves Latin a lot, right? And Rome, and antiquity. And then me being the person that I am, down came the lexicography and the etymology. I distributed a handout with two dictionary entries, one from the OED, civilize as a verb, and one from the OLD on cubilis. What does it mean to civilize a people, I asked. The students diligently took to the handout, and I'm gonna paraphrase a conversation I had and note that it is paraphrased and condensed for clarity and ease of transition. Okay, so student one says, well, it's clearly since foreign OLD determined by law, legal, and civil mores, right? They're talking about establishing the Roman state, etc. Okay. Now, it's like, what is this case? How do you civilize a people? How do you convince them to give up their languages and cultures? How do you convince them to make them one and the same state under a language? There's a lot that Flavio elides here, and it's not pretty or an innocent love of the language. He was not happy with this. He's clearly not talking about that. It's like, okay, he's not? No, adamantly, no, he is not talking about that. This student shut down. Mind you, this is day 2. Shut down, did not want to have this conversation. He was offended that I would even bring it up, right? That I would even suggest that something nefarious, something nefas was going on with this premium. So I asked, how do you know? It's my favorite question. How do you know? Because it's clearly implied that he's talking about language, not violence, like duh. And I said, that's a great point. Can language be violent? And another pause settled over the classroom. This is choreographed on my part. I said, turn to your yellow sheet. It was bright yellow, like highlighter yellow. Can I get a volunteer to read Sense 1A from the Ovidian? So this student, who was very offended, says, to bring a person, place, group of people, etc., to a stage of social development considered to be more advanced. Hierarchy, especially by bringing to conformity with the social norms of a developed society, to enlighten, refine, and educate, to make more cultured and sophisticated. Cool, all right, so fair enough. Can someone read Sense B, someone else? Another student, to tame or domesticate an animal. Another silence fell over the classroom. Once more, I asked a series of questions. What does it mean to civilize? What does it mean to tame or domesticate an animal? And who or what is configured as an animal? More to the point, for what reasons do the classics of Roman antiquity have a say in supposed development of the modern human? We had run out of time by this point in the class session, so I wrote a message to my students after class on Canvas. In it, I emphasized the prescience of my in-class questions. They weren't just to be obnoxious, although sometimes I really love being playing that role in the classroom. And that one can draw a line if one studies the intellectual and historical movements through European history between the traditional meanings of civilized, that which props up the state, that which attends to the needs of the state, and the more sinister implications of compulsory compliance in the erasure of difference. Furthermore, I highlighted that as the engines of merchant economies morphed into early modern capitalism, knowledge systems that began as the earnest and uncensored seeds of Renaissance humanism ended up being used to subjugate non-Europeans in the name of civility, perceived cultural superiority, and innate hierarchy. I also underscored that the humanities as a discipline of fields, from classics to comparative literature, from literary studies to the study of history, still bears the bruises of this historical past. And while it may seem distant when we discuss these moments of presentism in the classroom, I accentuated through a series of URLs that I screen capped here, that these contusions are still very much a part of our cultural heritage. The questions I posed remained unanswered on day 2, which is fine, it was day 2. But my overall goal for the course was to have my students develop their own answers to these questions based on the comparative analysis with which we would be frequently engaging. What this example illustrates in miniature is the potential pitfall we risk falling into when precise translation technique becomes more valuable than the content and message of the literature itself. Indeed, in some cases, definitive translation functions directly at odds with connotative nuance. In my approach to de-hierarchize the classroom, the hierarchy, that system of organization in which people or groups are ranked one above the other according to status or authority, becomes a more egalitarian environment for students. Not only do students have the opportunity to reevaluate the cultural and political context of word choice in literary works, but also they can reconceptualize their own role in the classroom itself. They transform from students sitting in the seats, zoning out as the lecturer speaks, and two inquisitive young scholars capable of thinking critically about the works, the complex material in front of them, and developing their own research questions. Before we get into remembering dismemberment, I'm gonna talk quite in depth about the rapes of Lucretia, excuse me, and Philomela. There's one slide here. This is a content warning of Lavinia, the character from Titus Andronicus, who is shown amputated, and it's very photorealistic. Just remember that it is it's fake, right? It's staged. But I wanted to share with you the extent to which the early moderns took this idea of ancient Roman sexual violence. It was literally on their stages. So I will let you know when the slide is about to come up, in case you don't want to see it. I understand, but I wanted to give that warning before we get in. So dismemberment, the action of cutting off a person's or animal's limbs, the action of partitioning or dividing up a territory or organization. By week 7, my students eventually came around to accepting my methods, if not relishing them, and getting used to the gray areas. And we had gotten into a good groove. So the first half of the class was delved into the concrete elements of Latin syntax and grammar, historical overview from the antique world, while the last half of class was my domain, looking at the ambiguity in the written word. In the 3 weeks prior to midterms, our conversation had turned to tales of Ovidian sexual violence. The decision was not for the sake of shock value alone. Rather, I designed this unit titled Ovid, Rome, and the Renaissance around the fashionable trend among Elizabethan poets, Ovidian poetry, particularly the kind that emphasizes violence against women. In this unit, we read stories of Lucretia's rape in Livy's Aber Condita and Ovid's Fausti, as well as Philomela's dismemberment in Book 6 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. In English, we read Arthur Golding's translation of the Metamorphoses, the very first English translation ever, like in existence. Shakespeare's long narrative poem, The Rape of Lucrece, as well as his earliest, bloodiest, and most gruesome play, the Roman-inspired Titus Andronicus. And here is an abbreviated list of the secondary works that we read, if you're at all curious. So it's a mismatch of early modern scholarship, some public intellectual stuff on Eidolon, and then this pretty famous essay from the 90s. To be clear, Shakespeare's iteration of the ancient city in Titus is not historically accurate. He does a lot of condensing. And Titus collapses both Roman history and myth into a macabre caricature in every sense of the word. Borrowing heavily on the rape and mutilation of Philomela and Virginia, the play follows the exploits of the disgraced titular character, Titus Andronicus, and his family as they navigate the brutality that the barbarians, the Goths, have infected the Roman state with. We had read the stories of Philomela from Book 6, as I said, and Lucretia in Book 2 of the Fausti, going through the contours and nuances of Ovid and ancient Rome. The dehumanization of Philomela's rape and mutilation are exaggerated to the point of caricature in Titus. In fact, I would call it what we call that specific subgenre, torture porn. Like if you look at stagings, they are really upsetting. The amount of delight that the characters take in female suffering is it's almost too much. But if you would like to see it, I've got some links that I can give you if you're interested in seeing how ancient Rome is staged for early modernists. The questions for my class was why Ovid? And why is the suffering and traumatization of women in particular the go-to snapshot of violence across the expanses of time? Do we delight in women's pain? Is their pain less sympathetic? And why is the traumatized body always female, feminized, or dehumanized? Moreover, there were plenty of gruesome tales Shakespeare could have chosen for his source material. A fair amount were from his own time period. Remember that this was the era of drawing and quartering, of disemboweling in the public streets, of burning heretics alive. Put another way, the literal sight and smell of torture was pervasive in 16th century London. Why Ovid? Compellingly, Lavinia's fate is more brutal than Philomella's. And even get more brutal than that. Chiron and Demetrius, the two sons of Tamora, the queen of the Goths, so the barbarians, ensnare Lavinia in a hunting trap, violently rape her, and cut out her tongue in Act 2. They literally get the idea from Ovid. But now being the civilized, my words, new Romans that they are also well-versed in Latin language and literature. They had learned Tyrrheus' lesson from Ovid. Philomela was still able to communicate her brutality through the weaving of her tapestry to let her sister Procne know what her husband did to her, what Procne's husband did to Philomela. So in order to keep Lavinia from similarly weaving a tapestry to describe her mutilation, Chiron and Demetrius also cut off Lavinia's hands. So this is the slide that's coming up, and it's pretty gruesome. Heightening and exaggerating the Ovidian violence in the process, and by Act 4, a visibly mutilated Lavinia is seen running after her little brother Lucius. So I just want to emphasize this is Act 2, and it gets worse, much worse. So here's an excerpt when Ovid is actually name dropped. I'll read it for us. Titus Andronicus says, "Lucius, what book is that she tosseth so? Grandsire, 'tis Ovid's Metamorphoses, my mother gave it to me. Soft, see how busily she turns the leaves. What would she find? Lavinia, shall I read? This is the tragic tale of Philomel, and treats of Tyrrheus' treason and his rape, and rape I fear was root of thine annoy. See, brother, see, note how she quotes the leaves. Lavinia, wert thou thus surprised, sweet girl? Ravished and wronged as Philomela was, forced in the ruthless, vast and gloomy woods? See, aye, such a place there is where we did hunt. Oh, had we never hunted there, patterned by that the poet here describes, patterned by that the poet here describes, by nature made for murders and for rapes." In response to this passage, one student pointed out the cultural and political power that knowing Ovid provides. In this scene, Lavinia uses her stumps to turn to Book 6 of the Metamorphoses in order to draw a distinct parallel between her own suffering and Philomela's. Moreover, Lavinia's only ability to communicate is through poetry of Ovid itself, and that's power because she knows it. She's studied it, and she's able to communicate, even though she has lost the means to do so conventionally. The original Latin in this dramatic staging thus mimics what poetry does for us as readers. I emphasize that it becomes an agent to communicate the pain of those whose voices are typically stripped from the conversation. In turn, this exercise impelled my students to think about how the text is itself an agentive force, how it confronts us with the brutal physical realities of ephemeral conceptual language like violence, misogyny, and vulnerability. Professor McGill led the charge, as always, in discussing the historical milieu of Ovid's gory violence in the classical world, and we, by assigning Glenmost's essay, Dissecti Membra Poetae, the rhetoric of dismemberment in Herodian poetry, we were provided with the vocabulary to talk critically about this gory violence, and to discuss in depth the ramifications of personhood, not just in our readings of Ovid, but also in Senecan tragedy, the tropes which Shakespeare called explicitly for Titus. In particular, most highlights the cultural significance of gladiatorial matches to which Senecan tragedy responds. These shows provided the repeated sight of the drastic animalization of human beings, even when they were not covered by animal skins. The sufferers were treated in a way and endured injuries of a sort familiar to most people only in the case of animals. Viewing their torments, many spectators could be thrilled to feel superior, intact, a survivor. For the relation of a man to an animal is like that of God to man. As several students pointed out in discussion, the contrast between Lavinia and her father in that Act 4 scene underscores the comparative lack of intactness of the former to the latter. Moreover, Ovidian and Senecan dismemberment in Shakespeare reveals the ever-blurred line between the animal and the human, or the human and the non-human. Dismemberment, as another student pointed out, also functions as shorthand from Lavinia and Philomela's losses of status to their respective in-groups. Lavinia's copy of Metamorphoses, like Philomela's tapestry before her, becomes her new language, her way to communicate, even though she has lost the human appendage that would allow her to speak, to weave, and to write. In this vein, our class referred back to Ovid's original Latin. Did we view it differently? Radix micat ultima linguae, ipsa jacet terraque tremens immurmurat atrae, utque savire solet utilatae, cauda calubrae, palpitat et moriens dominae rusticia quaerit. The mangled root quivers while the severed tongue lies palpitating on the dark earth, faintly murmuring. And as the severed tail of a mangled snake is wont to writhe, it twitches convulsively, and with its last dying movement, it seeks its mistress's feet. The description of Philomela's quivering, amputated tongue in Ovid previews the gruesome act that is actually shielded from the audience in Titus. But it also serves as a reminder that her inability to speak further makes her dependent upon those who can, the intact spectator that most describes. In Titus, we, the audience, become the spectators to the drastic animalization of human beings. Lavinia's own animalization is apparent in the stage direction. There's a moment where she takes the staff, this is directly from the Shakespeare folio from 1623. She takes the staff in her mouth and guides it with her stumps and writes. Lavinia here mimics the actions of Io, the young maiden transformed into a beautiful white calf, scratching into the dirt with her hoof to communicate her fate to her father. If scenes like these rupture the distinction between rational man and irrational animal, as most suggests, does Lavinia cease to be fully human here? After her tongue lies palpitating on the dark earth, faintly murmuring, ipsa jacet terraque tremens immurmurat atrae, is she still human? The message here is clear. A woman with the ability to speak is patently a danger to the masculinist hierarchy in Lavinia's and Philomela's worlds. The question then transforms into a discussion in class of Philomela's subsequent humanity, or supposed lack thereof. Is the amputated and muted Lavinia now an animal, or at the very least a non-human because she can no longer speak or write? Furthermore, to return to my questions on day 2, has she been civilized? Has she been domesticated? Has she been tamed? This muddy dialectic between human and non-human also recalls a second definition of dismemberment I proffered at the beginning of this section: the action of partitioning or dividing up a territory or organization. And let us not forget that sexual violence stems from the fundamental belief that women are fundamentally property in these narratives, objects to be used, traded, and discarded to serve as hegemonic masculine power structures. This language also reinforces Flavio's Roma triumphans, the violence of erasure, the civilizing force of una eademque civitas, one in the same state. It also reminds us that Renaissance humanists, the very people responsible for studying, translating, and disseminating the Latin classics from ancient Rome, for essentially devising the research and reading methods that we use in our fields of study today, told themselves that this language of conquering and imperialism, of coercion and compulsion, was a noble goal worth pursuing and perpetuating across the globe. It also brings to mind another powerful Roman narrative co-opted by Shakespeare and his contemporaries, the rape of Lucretia. A metaphor for the state itself, Lucretia's body is not dismembered. Rather, its bloody remnants serve as reminders to the tyranny of an abusive monarch. But what if we read Lucretia as more than just a strict metaphor for the state? What if our class read her as what she literally is in the text, a traumatized woman? While Livy's and Ovid's renditions are fairly sparse in allowing Lucretia to speak, by contrast, Shakespeare's rape of Lucrece shows the raped woman speaking directly back to her attacker. imploring him for dozens of lines to consider her personhood and social status. These comparative pairings highlight the artistic license Shakespeare takes in his own adaptation, to be sure. But they also prioritize rereading the Latin originals, going back and seeing what's different, what's the same, and coming up with potential ideas for why Shakespeare might have changed it. What is the meaning behind these decisions? Students went back and looked through the Livy and Ovid to see, one, when Lucretia speaks, and two, to see what she says. I cannot emphasize enough how powerful this pedagogical practice was. Remember, all of my students were male, and they, instead of discussing the necessity of Lucretia's suicide to ameliorate the unscrupulous monarchy that was ravaging the Roman state and to justify the foundation of the Roman Republic, right? My students revised their views of Lucretia as a fully human character with her own agency, even though it was violated. It's a big deal. In my remaining time, because I do want time for questions and conversation if you're so inclined, I want to share some of the comparisons I underscored between Shakespeare's Lucrece and the national conversation we're having about campus sexual violence, the Me Too movement, and believing women when they speak out. So these are quotations from The Rape of Lucrece. "Oh," quoth Lucretia, "I did give that life which she too early and too late hath spilled. Woe, woe," quoth Collatine, "she was my wife. I owed her, and 'tis mine that she hath killed. My daughter and my wife with clamor spilled. The dispersed air, who holding Lucrece's life, answered their cries, my daughter and my wife." In this instance, the family who mourns Lucretia mourns her role as both wife and daughter, rather than her individual personhood. The near constant appeals in this section to my daughter, my wife, elides her subjectivity, instead placing emphasis on her ravaged body's role for the health of the sovereign state. This adaptation of Ovid's poetry recalls similar rhetoric in our contemporary debate. She's someone. If you have encountered this defense in the wild, you've likely realized that it is nearly always well-meaning. They really want to emphasize how bad rape is. You don't want to do this to someone's sister, to her mother, to the daughter, to the wife, instead of the fact that it's an act of gruesome violence that is an invasion, right? And we could just not do it because it's not a good idea. It's also really bad. But in its determination to ask the reader to sympathize with the survivor of sexual violence, this rhetoric accidentally reveals the role women are still expected to play. She is not her own person, rather she is someone's daughter, someone's wife. In this pairing of past versus present, we begin to see that Lucretia is not just someone's wife and someone's daughter. My class saw that Lucretia is someone, full stop. When they had sworn to this advised doom, they did conclude to bear dead Lucrece thence, to show her bleeding body thorough Rome, and so to publish Tarquin's foul offense, which being done with speedy diligence, the Romans plausibly did give consent to Tarquin's everlasting banishment. How fitting that the very last lines, these are the last two couplets of Rape of Lucrece, are the rhyming couplet most clearly entwining the concept of consent with sovereignty. Lucretia's ravaged body, which she sacrificed for the good of the Republic, is exhibited through the streets of Rome. Her bleeding body is capable of expelling a tyrannical monarchy at the same time that it publishes Tarquin's foul offense. The consent among the Romans to banish Tarquin allows the people to avenge the invasion to Lucretia's body, to give consent to their own body republic, to which she was entitled but not granted. Her dead body in these instances is thus more of a person than the one who lived inside it. The bleeding body, therefore, is a site of mitigation, a social contract that promises to uphold the values of the state, a model that still pervades our definition of the term. So this is from Laurie Penny's Horizon of Desire. It's a long reads article where she looks at female sexual desire through the rhetoric of consent. Consent is a state of being. Giving someone your consent sexually, politically, and socially is a little like giving them your attention. It's a continuous process. It's an interaction, which of course is what the values of a republic are supposed to evoke, right? It's supposed to have the people's input, their consent. I think Shakespeare was very clever doing that, and also just so solid. Like if you wanna encapsulate everything, the fact that the penultimate line is about consent is really remarkable. I hadn't realized that before I actually read for this particular class period, and it was sort of mind-blowing. So for the last quote, here with a sigh, as if her heart would break, she throws forth Tarquin's name. He, she says, but more than he, her poor tongue could not speak, till after many accents and delays, untimely breathings, sick and short essays, she utters this, he, fair lords, 'tis he that guides this hand to give this wound to me. And her appeals to name her abuser, Lucretia's words in turn alleviate the nation state. With poor tongue and a breaking heart, she speaks with many accents and delays and untimely breathing. This moment of self-immolation, of self-sacrifice, recalls the drama from another moment in our recent collective memory. Christine Blasey Ford's testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee at Brett Kavanaugh's hearing for the Supreme Court. I believe it is my civic duty. The details that bring me here today are the ones I will never forget. They have been seared into my memory and haunted me. Blasey Ford may yet be our 21st century Lucretia, a woman haunted by the trauma of her past, her untimely breathings, sick and short essays, interrupting the rhythm of her powerful testimony that would ultimately make no political difference. Nevertheless, she persisted. I believe it is my civic duty, she argued, to reopen personal trauma for the continued health of the nation. In her sacrificial testimony, we hear the faint echoes of Lucretia's own sworn statement, he, fair lords, 'tis he that guides this hand to give this wound to me. Thank you.